Good morning. Nice to talk to this small group. So thank you for having me. I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been working on with a number of people, namely Anna Wexler, who is my co-PI at UPenn, but we've also had a number of students working with us on this project, so they've all been super helpful. So I probably don't need to tell this audience that ethics and novel neurotechnology has been a growing area. A lot of ethicists think that it's especially significant because of the special importance of the brain for important philosophical and human concepts such as the self, the mind, autonomy, agency, authenticity. And so you really see a proliferation of literature about the way that neurotech is going to affect these concepts and ideas and values that are important to us. Several people, and this is kind of the premise of neuroethics, which is a unique field, have suggested that neurotech comes with unique ethical issues because of the role that the brain plays in these kind of special topics. So people have talked about things like ownership of neural data, privacy of mental states, responsibility for technologically mediated action. We already have heard about some of this, and mental integrity. And as a result of this idea that neurotech poses unique ethical issues, there's been a proliferation of ethics guidance for neurotech. And I speak as someone who is a co-author and was a member of working groups that created some of the kind of more influential guidance documents, ethical guidance documents for neurotechnology. These are just a few. I'll say a little bit more in a second about some of the other ones. So, even though I have worked to help produce some of this ethics guidance, I am going to be talking today about a project that is essentially rooted in skepticism about the purpose and function of ethics guidance for neurotechnology. So, it's not always clear to me why ethicists create guidance documents, other than getting a publication in a fancy journal, which is like very nice, but it's not clear that it actually does anything. So, the hypothesis of my research with Anna is that ethics guidance for neurotech is necessary. It's good to think about these ethical issues, but it's actually not doing what it should be doing. It's not doing what it's meant to do. And what it's meant to do is to actually foster ethical neuroscientific research. So, to begin, I want to think a little bit about possible functions or purposes of ethics guidance. And I'll say a little bit later on what I think ethics guidance kind of is. But let's say broadly, there are a variety of ways we might understand ethics guidance. So I think the first and the most intuitive is probably behavior guidance. So we might think that an ethics guidance document that aims at behavior guidance is intended as a resource that is going to somehow influence an agent's decision-making process. And there are lots of forms this could take. We see this in the literature: questions or points to consider, flowcharts of steps for a particular process, guiding principles, codes of conduct. Like, there's a reason that the Belmont Report and the Four Principles and the Declaration of Helsinki and what have you have been influential. It's because this is kind of the core purpose of these guidance documents. But there are also different types of ethics guidance documents. So the next is professional standards. So these are different in that they are kind of eventually meant to influence behavior, but what they're really meant to do is use the kind of force or authority of a professional organization in order to set standards for a field. This is more successful in fields where you have some kind of professional requirements, like licensing or something like that. It's why philosophers maybe never have professional standards, but they establish what is kind of acceptable in that field. Ethics guidance, and we're kind of getting more cynical as we go down the list, might also provide post hoc justification. Someone might do a novel study. He Jiankui, who used CRISPR, is a good example of this. He kind of not only did something that a lot of people thought was unethical, but he published an ethics guidance document for the research that he did, which I find psychologically fascinating. So someone might create ethics guidance for something that they kind of already did to be like, look, what I did is okay. So they can then kind of point to it and say that what they did was fine. Ethics guidance might also do a form of soft signaling that a topic is important, right? So even if it doesn't influence behavior, it might be a way of saying like, hey, we should be paying attention to this. Like we should be paying attention to neurotech, or we should be paying attention to AI. And people have already pointed to this idea that guidance documents can achieve impact by changing values, narratives, and agenda. And then most cynically is ethics washing. And this is the idea that, for example, we heard yesterday about industry and the way that some companies might be interested in ethics. And we hear about greenwashing, right? Like companies want to get certain certifications to look like they're doing things that are environmentally friendly. Similarly, companies might want to participate in the creation of ethical guidance to look like they're doing something that is permissible and is not morally problematic. So in this quote, they're described as playing a more decorative than developmental or foundational role. So I want to suggest that ethics guidance does have a core function, and I think the core function is behavior guidance. I think the paradigmatic examples of ethics guidance, again, Belmont Report, Declaration of Helsinki, and so on, seem to be aimed at behavior guidance. And I want to take the term guidance here at face value and suggest that an ethics guidance document should guide ethical behavior. What does that mean? I'm just saying guidance again. It means that it should help individuals identify what they ought to do morally in a given domain. This should impact their moral behavior, which is pertinent to their moral obligations or to the promotion of well-being, right? To broadly take a consequentialist and deontological perspective. And then since ethics guidance is thought to make a concrete difference to what people do, it shouldn't just identify what they ought to do morally in a given domain, but kind of theoretically, it ought to actually affect what they do, not just what they think about what they do. Okay, so in the next part of the talk, I'm going to describe the empirical side of this study. So this is kind of the conceptual foundation of it. My co-author Anna and I did a literature review where we kind of looked for neuroethics guidance documents, and then we did a content analysis on those guidance documents to try to understand what components they had and to hypothesize about the way that those components might influence the ability of those documents to fulfill this core function. So I'll take you there. So what is neuroethics guidance? Since they're philosophers, I would love to talk about these definitions if you want to. It took us a while to figure them out. So we said, to count as guidance, a document should, as its primary contribution, offer any of these words: recommendations, guidance, guidelines, principles, obligations, questions, a normative framework, or a code of conduct, which will help practitioners broadly, researchers, practitioners, scientists, clinicians, make a decision about how to use, implement, or study neurotechnology in a moral, ethical, responsible, just, fair, good, right, or beneficial way. What does it mean if its primary contribution is guidance? It should be the central outcome of the study or the focus of its conclusion. We made this provision because a lot of the documents that we found offer guidance, kind of like somewhere, but that's not the main point of the publication. What is neurotech? I feel like I know we're going to get questions about this, but neurotechnology refers to a device or process that interacts with the central nervous system directly without other technological mediation in order to change the brain's capacity to function, alter the manner of its function, or produce knowledge of its structure or function that will in turn facilitate outcomes 1 or 2. We wanted to avoid getting documents that only looked at using neurotech for understanding how the brain works. We wanted to get documents that looked at neurotech because generally neurotech that understands how the brain works is not as controversial as neurotech that will actually help people to do something or change the way people already do something. This is maybe too small to see, maybe not. This is our Prisma document of how we found the literature. I am happy to kind of share any of these methods with people. We started with 414 unique articles. We screened them initially for title and abstract to see if they were related to the definition of neurotechnology I just gave you, to see if they had substantive ethics content, to see if they were animal research. We were interested in work with humans, and to see if they were not in English because we couldn't assess them. We then screened the resulting 170 articles via full text review and identified which ones were not related to neurotech, took those out, and identified those that did not have substantive ethics guidance. And we ended up with 38 papers total, and that's adding on that right side citation chaining, which is known as gray literature. And so it's identifying guidance documents that other guidance documents cited frequently. And so those were assessed for eligibility in the same way that the others were, and were added. There were not a lot of those. Okay, we then did a content analysis of these guidance documents. So we developed a deductive and inductive codebook. What does that mean for the non-empiricists? It means that deductive, prior to looking at the data set, we came up with a list of components that we thought would influence the effectiveness of the guidance documents at influencing their core purpose. Inductive means that as we looked at the documents, we realized we had left out some categories, and so we added those. I will note that our last code is actionability, which we developed a scale to assess, which again, I'd be really happy to talk about, but the 5-point scale moves from documents that are not at all actionable. This means that they gave recommendations that were described using abstract terms without specifying who enacts them, how they are enacted, or in what context they are enacted. Ethical issues were generic and not context specific, so it might be something like, autonomy is important with neurotech, like promote it. That would be a 1. At the other end, there were recommendations that were extremely actionable. So they used concrete terms, they specified who enacted the recommendations, how to enact them, and in what context. The recommended actions were feasible and were possible or ready to implement in practice. Some of these were protocols, decision trees, tools, and procedures, and we did have a few examples of these. So then we went back to thinking about the efficacy of ethics guidance for fulfilling its core purpose, and looking at literature from other areas. This is mainly AI ethics and nursing ethics. There's a literature about like what makes guidance effective, and actually in AI ethics, there's been more skepticism about the ability of ethicists to produce guidance documents that are actually useful. And so there we identified 4 factors that this literature suggests will influence efficacy of ethics guidance for its core purpose of fostering ethical behavior. The first was kind of the rationale or the starting point for creating guidance. Is it starting from philosophers' curiosity, or is it starting from like an actual problem? Again, the examples I've cited, Belmont Report, Declaration of Helsinki, those are coming from things that people did that were very bad. And they were like, we need principles, we need guidance. And that is a thing that makes a guidance document more efficacious because there is a clear need for it. The second is participation with the intended audience. So is it only ethicists? Or are there institutions? Is there like government? Is there stakeholder involvement, like people who will actually use the neurotech? Is there industry involvement? Third is this actionability point, which was this kind of variety of terms we looked at to see if the guidance was too general to kind of like meaningfully identify specific things that people ought to do. Some of this, again, the reason it's specific, and I can talk more about this later, is that if you just say like promote autonomy, you can justify a whole lot of things under that. And so you want it to be actionable and specific so people know what to do and are not just like, I can use this to justify whatever I want to do, which is something people do. And the fourth point was the extent and the mode of dissemination. So is the guidance published only in specialist journals, or is it accessible? Results, I'm gonna try to go a little faster because I might be running out of time. So the data set in terms of connection to real world practice showed that the guidance documents we looked at had diverse motivations ranging from pragmatic to aspirational. In terms of connecting with kind of on-the-ground needs. Very few of them explicitly cited people's practical needs as their impetus for creation. In terms of participatory development, 1/3 of the guidelines were silent on process. They're just kind of like issued from on high. International policy documents were produced by committees of experts. Almost all papers had an interdisciplinary authorship with a combination of practicing physicians, legal scholars, researchers, and ethicists. Over 1/3 of them were produced by expert working groups, workshops, or consortium discussions. We all know, or some of us know, that this is a good way to get funding. And then you have something you produce as a result. And you're like, hey, we produce guidance, so thank you for funding us. And only 2 documents were produced solely by ethicists. In terms of actionability, we rated the documents we looked at according to the actionability scale I showed you earlier. They varied substantially, but kind of encouragingly and unsurprisingly, the documents clustered in the middle. So it was a very nice bell curve. There were a few that were extremely actionable. There were a few that were not actionable at all. And in terms of dissemination, the majority of documents did explicitly name an intended audience, which is helpful, so you know kind of who they're writing to. 1/4 of the documents had like an implicit audience, so you needed to infer who the target audience was, and only a few, 3, didn't have any indication of the target audience. The majority of articles with either an explicit or implicit intended audience targeted researchers, while half were directed at healthcare providers, followed by regulators and industry. And most were published in general scientific or medical journals, with just a few in ethics journals. So what we found, we think, is that while many neuroethics documents are moderately actionable, we do think we kind of confirmed our hypothesis, which is that they're not as actionable as they could be. They're not necessarily fulfilling their core purpose. They're not directly motivated by real-world practitioner-defined concerns. They do not involve individuals with various stakes in their creation. They have moderate actionability, and they're often disseminated in academic journals. So if the goal is to impact behavior of practitioners who are not always academics, then we think a lot of existing neuroethics guidance doesn't have the components needed to serve this purpose. 2 more slides, I think I'm almost out. So we are 2 co-authors, a social scientist and a philosopher, and we have 2 ideas for what results from this study. One, I think, is more optimistic about the purpose of ethics guidance, and it's basically saying, if we want to keep doing ethics guidance, we know what makes it effective. Let's do that, right? So let's address the connection to real-world practice. Let's address participatory development. Let's address actionability, and I'm missing a point there, but let's address dissemination by thinking about how to make guidance more available to people who can actually use it. So that's like assuming that ethics guidance is a good thing to do. Like, let's make it better at what it's meant to do. As the philosopher, the second idea is more skeptical about ethics guidance. So if we are using ethics guidance to impact behavior, I think we really need to question whether or not this is how we should be going about things. So according to, again, a certain philosophical picture, maybe a Kantian philosophical picture of ethical action, to enable ethical behavior is to facilitate individuals' abilities to use their skills of ethical reasoning to identify the right thing to do for themselves, or at least to be able to follow someone else's chain of reasoning or someone else's argument for why they should do something. It's not for them to just accept what they ought to do because a bunch of ethicists told them in an article in Nature. It's to actually like show them how to reach that conclusion themselves. So, philosophically sound ethics guidance should engage with the why of ethical behavior, the reasons for acting in certain ways rather than others, more than with the what or the how, which reflect more the mechanics of ethical behavior itself. And I realize there's some maybe inconsistency here in that the actionability scale we proposed the more actionable guidance documents might be doing exactly what I think they shouldn't be doing, which is telling people specifically what they ought to do without engaging with the reasons why they ought to do that. So this is a 3-year NSF-funded project. We just finished the 2nd year. We just launched a survey of neurotechnology researchers where we are asking them about the efficacy and their knowledge of the ethics guidance documents that we identified in this first stage. So we're already getting it literally just went live last week. We're already getting some really interesting comments. And then we are hoping to hold some discussions between neurotech researchers and ethicists about these questions we have about the purpose, efficacy, and actionability of ethics guidance. Thank you so much, and luckily this is still funded by the NSF. Keep your fingers crossed for us.
My name is Cody Turner. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at Bentley University. Last year I was a postdoc at UMass Boston. So this presentation is just it's a survey from a white paper that I completed at the culmination of the postdoc last year. So I don't purport for this to be a novel argument. It's really more of just a survey of a white paper. And I want to start by just doing a live poll. So this is something that I've been experimenting with my students this past semester. I've been vibe coding apps using Claude Cowork. And it's been pedagogically useful and I'll give my students different ethical statements and then they can anonymously vote in real time on a scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree. And so I thought it might be fun to just start with a quick poll of that nature. And so yeah, you can scan the barcode. Oh, it's okay, I got it, Michael. You can scan the barcode or you can go to this link. And then once you get to the website, you enter via the participation mode, and then the room code is X68FG. Let me know if anyone has any trouble accessing this. I think I vibe coded it, so it should work. But I'm not a coder, so. Okay, it says 8 audience members connected. So I tried to think of statements that might divide the room. There might not be consensus, so we'll see if I achieve that. So the first one, the concept of mental privacy is already obsolete. We freely surrender granular psychological data to social media algorithms every day. Brain data collection is merely a more direct version of what we have already consented to. And so what's your intuition on that statement from a scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree? That might be because I already pressed this. That's my bad. I was a little too quick to the trigger there.
It says waiting for the presenter to select a statement.
Okay.
You got a statement?
I think it's because I already clicked on it, so it might have shut it down. So yeah, we have 7 out of 7, so let's see, then we can do the second statement. Hopefully that should work for you. Okay, there's consensus on this one. Consensus on the fact that brain data, the threat of neurocapitalism, seems to be substantially different in nature than surveillance capitalism. The next one, a commercial airline pilot who refuses to wear a non-invasive neural fatigue monitor, one that could prevent a crash, is exercising cognitive liberty at the expense of passenger safety. The airline should be within its rights to ground them. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on there. Apologies. Okay, it says 4 out of 6, 6 out of 6, okay. All right, this one has a good deal of disagreement. So I want to talk about each of these, the ethics surrounding each of these statements, but I just thought that might be a fun kind of interactive poll to get things started. So I want to start just by, yesterday a lot of the speakers talked both about the clinical applications of neurotechnology and the consumer wellness applications. I just want to start just by reflecting on the distinction between therapy and enhancement, and particularly the fact that the boundary between therapy and enhancement is objectively fuzzy, and that applies with respect to all technologies, including neurotechnology. And so just a couple of examples to illustrate that. Transcranial current stimulation is a non-invasive neuromodulation technique that's used to treat things like depression, chronic pain, stroke rehabilitation. It's also being explored to boost working memory in healthy people. And so you could ask yourself, imagine someone who has borderline cognitive decline, and they use transcranial direct current stimulation to improve their working memory. Does that count as a kind of therapy, or does that count as a kind of enhancement? And I would say there is no objective answer to that question. Or to take another example, you could imagine someone with borderline ADHD symptoms, and they use some kind of neurofeedback mechanism to improve their focus. Again, it seems like there's no really objective answer to the question of whether it's a kind of therapy or a kind of enhancement. So I feel like that's an important point. It's still true that there is no objective line between day and night, but there are clear cases of day and night, and I think the same applies with respect to neurotechnology, right? We can think of clear cases that intuitively fall into the enhancement bucket versus the therapy bucket. And here in this talk, I want to focus more on some of the ethical considerations surrounding the wellness and consumer tech market surrounding neurotechnology, but a lot of what I say will also apply to clinical applications. Well, I want to focus more on the neuroenhancement side. And one question that we briefly explore in the white paper is the question of whether neuroenhancement could facilitate a kind of moral enhancement, right? If we use neurotechnology to enhance ourselves in myriad different ways, can that make us better people morally? And I think it holds promise in potentially doing so, but it doesn't necessarily do so. And so just another distinction can be made between cognitive neuroenhancement and affective neuroenhancements, right? Neurotechnologies that improve your memory, improve your intention would fall into the cognitive side, and then neurotechnologies that might boost your mood or your empathy would fall on the affective side. And so you can imagine, the example that I have here, a con artist who uses neuroenhancement to improve their memory. That doesn't necessarily make them a better person morally. It might just make them a better con artist. And so it's similar to the kind of AI alignment point, how a more intelligent AI doesn't necessarily translate to a more moral AI. And then similarly, you can imagine someone using like a mood enhancer to increase their empathy. Does that necessarily make them a better person? Well, that's contestable. Right? So the psychologist Paul Bloom, for example, has a pretty provocative book called Against Empathy, where he argues that emotional empathy isn't always virtuous. It's not always morally conducive. It's parochial. It can fuel in-group favoritism. And so dialing up your empathy via some kind of neuromodulation enhancement doesn't necessarily make you a better person. It could arguably make you a more tribal person. And so you can see this, right, that neuroenhancement doesn't necessarily translate to moral enhancement with respect to each of the three main normative ethical theories. And so I just want to give an example of this with respect to consequentialism, virtue ethics, and Kantian deontology. So consequentialism, this is kind of similar to age-old thought experiments like the experience machine thought experiment from Robert Nozick. But you can imagine someone takes a mood enhancer and that allows them to always be happy, right? They can suppress any feelings of depression. They can flatten grief. That might be sanctioned on a kind of crude version of hedonic consequentialism, where if everyone is taking these mood enhancers, everyone's happy, there's not as much grief in the world anymore, that's a better world. But that arguably is a kind of reductio ad absurdum on hedonic consequentialism, right? I think a lot of people would be of the opinion that grief has a role to play in the good life. And so again, this doesn't necessarily lead to a morally better world if everyone is dampening their grief in situations where it might be appropriate to feel grief. Similarly, with virtue ethics, right, you can imagine a kind of neurotechnology that, say, reduces your impulse control, right? And so now is someone's neuroenhancement facilitated virtuous behavior, if it's the result of that neuroenhancement, is it truly virtuous, given that Aristotle says that virtues require practice and habituation and skillful agency over a period of time? Does that not genuinely count as virtue if you're kind of bypassing that via some kind of neuromodulation? Not necessarily. I think someone could argue that maybe that helps you scaffold virtue development. So if you have more impulse control, you have more of an opportunity to develop virtues on your own accord. But again, it doesn't necessarily make you a better person on a virtue ethics account either. And then Kantian deontology, right? So Kant thinks that the moral valence of an act is determined by the motive behind the act, not the consequences that it generates, right? The reasons for why someone's acting. And Kant, of course, thinks that the best actions are done from a motive of duty instead of a motive of inclination. right? So as an example, someone helps a homeless person on the street, but they do it out of a felt sense of sympathy. That's not as morally good, according to Kant, as someone helping that same person out of a sense of moral duty, right? Because they're abiding by the categorical imperative and the laws of morality. And so, again, you can imagine someone uses neuromodulation to boost their empathy, and now they feel tons of sympathy towards people, and they start exhibiting more altruistic behavior. That wouldn't necessarily make you a morally ideal person on Kant's view if your actions, good as though they may be, are done from a motive of inclination instead of a motive of duty. And so just 3 quick examples to illustrate again that on all the 3 main normative ethical theories, neuroenhancement doesn't necessarily translate to moral enhancement. And so to kind of transition briefly to the Neurorights debate, which was talked about by multiple speakers yesterday, given that there's so much disagreement on all of these normative ethical theories, they all have different verdicts about whether any given neurotechnology case is good or bad. For neurotechnology governance, it makes sense to follow medical ethics and adopt mid-level ethical principles, right? Things like autonomy, dignity, fairness, principles that all normative ethical theories can agree on. And these principles are already being operationalized in legal form in the form of Neurorights. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because the Neurorights debate and chronology was, I think, outlined in considerable detail yesterday, but just a kind of brief juxtaposition of positions that people can take in the Neurorights debate, right? There's this question, should there be sui generis Neurorights? And if you think that brain data is especially intimate, especially potentially privacy violative, maybe you think that, yeah, there should be like new Neurorights that guard our brain data, because our brain data is different than other kinds of data, right? It allows for unprecedented kinds of ethical transgressions like mind reading or mind control in the limit. So you might think, like, yeah, we need actually a new right to privacy. It's not sufficient to just extend existing privacy frameworks that we have on the books. But then someone might take the opposite perspective and say, well, actually brain data, it's really like other sensitive data, right? It doesn't necessarily pose more privacy risks compared to things like genetic information, and to think that it does, someone might accuse you of like a kind of neuroexceptionalism. Other people have talked about, like Stephen Rainey, the risk of rights or rights inflation, right? Where you start enacting so many new different rights that you end up devaluing rights protections in general across the board. So there's this debate. Obviously, brain data needs special protection, but how exactly do we adjudicate that in the form of policy? And this matters, of course, because there are tons of ethical threats that neurotechnology poses, a lot of which, again, were talked about yesterday, and I just want to drill down on 2 of those in a bit more detail. Again, more on the kind of neuroenhancement consumer application side of things. So first, neurocapitalism, right? So surveillance capitalism, which is a term coined by the Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff, is a term to describe essentially the economic system governing the digital economy. It was, according to on her account, invented by Google in 2001, where Google realizes we have all this digital exhaust, this data from users that isn't strictly used to improve the customer experience. And they realized, oh, we can actually use this digital exhaust to create behavioral profiles of users that we can then sell to advertisers. And so Google does this at the beginning of the 21st century. Their revenue shoots up. The rest of Silicon Valley follows along. And then very quickly, at the birth of the digital economy, it gets kind of fixed to this economic model of surveillance capitalism, right? Where your data is constantly being mined, and data brokers are constantly making inferences about you and then selling that to advertisers. And so the worry is that the next phase of this could be something like neurocapitalism, right? Where it's not just your digital exhaust on search engines that's being mined, but your actual brain data becomes the kind of currency. And we're already seeing, this isn't just in the realm of science fiction anymore, right? We're already seeing kind of rudimentary versions of this. The example from the opening, the ethical statement about someone wearing an EEG to track their fatigue, this is already happening. So there's a company called SmartCap. 5,000 plus workplaces monitor worker fatigue by EEG, including miners, truck drivers, people who are in dangerous jobs, right, where their fatigue might need to arguably be monitored. And so you might, again, it seems like there wasn't consensus in the room about whether that kind of thing is ethically justified, but you might think, yeah, that is ethically justified in certain dangerous professions. And then, so kind of, again, rudimentary version of neurocapitalism, the company Emotive had a collaboration with L'Oreal, And they had EEG headsets in select YSL stores that measured brain responses to fragrances and then offered like emotionally tailored fragrance recommendations to the people based upon their brain responses. And then there's a whole field of neuromarketing that's kind of getting off the ground. And yeah, I think the risk is that, it's not just that innovation outpaces responsible regulation. It's that an entire generation of people have been conditioned by surveillance capitalism into thinking that it's normal, right? Completely okay with the mining of their data. And some people prefer it. They just like the convenience trade-off for the privacy trade-off, right? They like the fact that Amazon can know what pair of shoes they want before they want it. And so all of those facts are reasons to think that we should be worried about neurocapitalism as the next phase of surveillance capitalism. All right, a few more slides. Another risk that was touched upon yesterday is neurodiscrimination, right? So neuroprofiling, some potential examples could be people using neurometrics in hiring or admissions, insurers using neuro risk factors to decide premiums for someone's insurance. And this kind of neurodiscrimination, it could have a negative effect for people with neurodiversity just because they have atypical neural patterns compared to what's considered the norm. And to me, this relates to the Miranda Fricker's philosopher's concept of epistemic justice. Right? She has this concept of testimonial injustice, which is when you don't give someone's testimony the weight it deserves based upon like certain prejudices you have about them, like their identity or something like that. And so you can imagine in this world of neuroenhancement, there's a kind of unenhanced, enhanced divide, and the unenhanced people, their testimony is not given as much weight simply because they're unenhanced, even though nothing about them actually changed. Similarly, on the kind of moral injustice side, if enhancement raises the baseline of acceptable moral behavior, the non-enhanced people fall below it without having gotten worse. And so they're recategorized into a disfavored class without even having changed. And so I think this is kind of a version of people might be against smartphones right today, but you don't really have a choice. Like, you need a smartphone in order to participate in society. And you can imagine the kind of pressure to engage in neuroenhancement to avoid this kind of neurodiscrimination, for example. And then lastly, all of this is reasons to think that we need robust consent mechanisms, right? And so just a few words to close off on consent. These consent mechanisms, they should be dynamic, right? So consent should be renewed when data practices change or commercial partnerships change in the relevant company. They should be layered, right? There should be, and Michael Young talked about this yesterday, there should be separate consent mechanisms for data collection as there is from like the implantation of the actual device, right? So consent for the device versus consent for the data that's mined from the device. And there should also be consent mechanisms targeted towards explantation and not just implantation. And so Frederick Gilbert talks about a patient who was engaging in deep brain stimulation for treatment-resistant depression, and that led to an experience of self-estrangement and suicidal ideation, and the patient refused removal, even though the doctor recommended that they remove the device. And so this leads to a very thorny kind of consent problem where the device shapes the very self that was doing the consenting. And this relates to the concept of transformative experiences from the philosopher L.A. Paul. The idea being that there are some experiences in life that are so transformative, they change you as a person, they change what you value. You can't actually anticipate how you're going to look like on the other side of the experience. And so how can you actually have informed consent, given that you have no idea how your values are going to change? And people talk about this with respect to like becoming a parent, but it certainly applies with respect to more radical forms of neuroenhancement as well. And not just neuroenhancement, but like therapeutic applications too. And lastly, these are recommendations that we outline at the end of our white paper. I would hope that these are at least quasi-actionable on Laura's scale. We do go into more detail on all of these in the paper, but I think I'm brushing up against time constraints now, so I won't go over these, but these are different recommendations that we make. So thank you very much. There is a QR code here to the white paper if you're interested, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I was so excited yesterday because so many of the talks I felt like kind of poured in to help me with my problem of having way too much. Because I wanted to transition us from sort of the more clinical setting to some concerns around the more like the consumer market and sort of more general enhancement. And so, I'm not really an ethicist, and I am not really an expert in brain-machine interfaces, but my background is in philosophy of mind, and I have been very concerned about how when we change our embodiment, our sort of world interfaces more broadly, and our sort of embedding in technology, how it transforms us. So what I wanted to do is to sort of give a little bit of maybe background, sort of nuggets for a discussion about our sort of embodied mind, and then the meeting of that, not with necessarily FDA approval processes, but this kind of Wild West consumer market capitalism. I'm going to use Don Eide later on, and he calls our sort of natural body, non-enhanced body, body one, right? Body without technology. And I wanted to just think a little bit about how do we, with body one, control our actions. So if you all kind of raise your hand, you can all do that. And then I ask, how did you do that? Do you know? Right, so this is we will get back to more this kind of the opacity of the medium. We don't know the means. We don't know which brain processes helped us with that, how our nervous system functioned in that. We probably do something like an anticipation of the outcome. So many different theoretical fields have, so pragmatism, control theory, sensory motor theory, predictive coding, whatever, all these theories basically go with some kind of idea that we control an action by, anticipating to some extent the outcome that we want when this is already an habitual connection that, of course, our brain is the supporting, mediating vehicle of, right? So so you can't do it. So if I ask you to do, a triple axel or whatever on ice, you can't do it, right? You can't just let me anticipate myself doing a triple axel. No, right? Like the habitual means of that is not in place in most of us, right? So your action, but when something is in your repertoire, so this is Bill Powers, who was like this thinker of control theory, a sort of cybernetic theory. And what he was interested in how you can reach the same outcome with very different means, right? So you could still raise your hand if it's like a heavier jacket, right? And you now use more motor force, but you don't even notice that, right? So you can have these variable conditions, but a stable outcome through this kind of control theory. Pentti Marttinen is a Finnish philosopher sort of inspired by pragmatism, and I think it's very interesting how he thinks of this sort of anticipation and sort of sensory motor grounding as very important for basic consciousness and what he calls cognitive distance. I don't have time to talk much about that, but what I just want to focus on here is his focus on how this only works when you have a stability of the circumstances. Right. So now, if we return to the sort of control of action, you could think of your action repertoire as these things. What can you do this sensory motor jump to? What are the outcomes that you can anticipate? Right. It does not involve the triple axel for me, right? Where I can then do this jump into that future in a sense with the means I have. Right. So. Now, of course, why do I talk about all this at this conference? Because these facts about how our nervous system and our body one works is incredibly important for our actually capability to extend our action through technology, and our capability of using brain-machine interfaces, right? And having these prosthetic limbs and etc., how that works. But also with more general technology. So I'll get back to that, but I just want to say, like I asked you, how did that work, right? It's a little bit like magic. It just works, right? And that John Dewey is very interesting with this because he is talking about how magic is like kind of found when it's hoped to get results without intelligent control of the means. Also when it's supposed that a means can exist and yet remain inert and inoperative. He's like saying, all hocus pocus is the assumption that results can be accomplished without joint adaptation to each other of human powers and physical conditions. So of course, in our nervous system case, there has been this historic adaptation, right? That then grounds the feeling of magic that you can, have. But I also want to sort of stress, maybe sort of in opposition to Dewey, that, that there's a difference between believing in magic as, this can happen without means, as opposed to believe that something can happen via means that are unknown, right? So they're still means, right? But they are unknown to us, or outside of intelligent control. Right? He leaves out cases where we trust processes reliable so far, albeit without knowing or being capable of controlling and repairing them. And, I'm saying it's pretty normal in many biological, ecological, cosmological cases that there are means like that we don't know and can't control, but that we have been able to adapt to create these kind of outcomes that we don't fully understand. All we can do is accept the regularity of the consequences and adapt via, and then we can create control within that kind of condition. Okay. And another bit of setup is, I've already alerted to this, like when you don't know how you did the action, our own nervous system is completely opaque to us. We do not know it, right? And this is really, really, I always find it so fun when rereading Descartes, right? And his dualism, right? So he has this completely transparent mind that is then supposed to attach to the body at the pineal gland. And of course, if God is not a deceiver, we should perceive the pineal gland, right? We should, as the mind connects to the body, see what's there, the pineal gland, right? But that would be useless, right? The whole point of the nervous system is that it is opaque so that we can get that cognitive distance that Pentti Martinen talks about, so that we can perceive the world at the end, the fire at the foot, right? As Descartes then must say, nature has taught us, and it's probably better even if it's not true, right? And the brain, of course, is, when you look at the layers of protection underneath the skull, right? The brain has, by evolution, been removed from the world, right? Protected through all these layers. It is so adaptable, but it must be accessed through these sensory motor channels of the body where it can, interface with the world. The brain itself, right, is being kept up there in the skull, away from everything and unsensed, right? It's the unknown backside that creates the magic. Okay, so far so good. Now if we then return to Don Eide and technology, and we can begin to talk about body two, right? What Don Eide talks body two when we have added to our biological body. And so he, already in the 90s, wrote this book, Technology and the Life World, and theorized these different kinds of relations that we can have with technology. So he theorized 4 different relations, And here we'll focus mostly on the embodiment relation. So this is, so his sort of neat notation structure here is like that you can have in an embodiment relation, so this me and the pen, we are an embodiment relation, and I meet the paper as body 2, me plus pen, right? And my attention is sort of at the end of the pen and the beginning of the paper, right? And so this is where, so he put parentheses, so human technology meets world, right? So you see that line, or you have the parentheses, putting me together with the technology and the point of interaction with the world, where I perceive my affordance space, where my action possibilities begin, is should I write an A or an B, right? This is my, and now I can create my magic here, me and pen, right? So now I have like included the technology in my feedback loop and my action repertoire, right? And like already Heidegger described how with a hammer, you know, in the embodiment relation, so here we have like a hammer, or you could do, Merleau-Ponty talks about the keyboard, everybody talks about the car and how the size of the car becomes incorporated in your body image and you move with it, right? Except when you back up, right? Okay, so with a hanger, no, okay. So, but you get the idea that we now have created, so this is Merleau-Ponty talks a lot about how you then transform the affordance space. So now you have adapted to this body with whatever particular you pick your technology of choice in the embodiment relation. Now the world affords new things to this new body with these new capabilities. Okay. So far, so good. So here now we, of course, rely on other aspects of the stabilities of the world, stabilities of the pen, that it doesn't all of a sudden melt under my hand, etc. So there is like trusting in the conditions of, you know, the circumstances that makes this magic possible. Okay. I won't say too much about the other embodiment or the other relations, but I can just say what they are. So Eide also talks about a hermeneutic relationship to technology, where, so this could be when you read like a thermometer, for example, right? So now you are meeting the world that is sort of interpreted through the thermometer, right? So like now you're, and so like you can say that, and he also talks about books, for example, right? So it opens like a fictional or a represented world behind the technology, sort of, and so that's the hermeneutic part. We can also interact with the technology, right? Where the other is like where our meeting becomes focally with the technology, ATM machine or chatbot or whatever you are now interacting with the technology. But like maybe the background relation is more important to us as we turn to brain-machine interfaces. The background relation there, like Eide's favorite examples, is something like a thermostat. Or I actually love, my favorite example of his is the scarecrow. Right, so the scarecrow is a bit of automating technology that keeps away the birds without you having to do anything, right? So here the technology works in the background. You are not interacting with the technology, you're not incorporating it into your body, just working in the background, right? And now you could see that how that like kind of relation might be interesting when we think of neurotech, for example, right? Because there's a background thing, but it's a background within our body rather than within the space. Okay. So Peter Paul Verbeek here is like, so like Don Eide, who sadly recently passed, was a sort of creator of this area of philosophy of technology that he calls post-phenomenology. And Verbeek is working within this tradition, and he says, but now our new smart technologies, they need like new categories beyond the classic 4 categories that Eide theorized. And what is important for us here is that he talks about the cyborg relation. He also talks about an immersion relation, an augmentation relation that could also be interesting, but I'm going to skip them for sort of and just focus on the cyborg relation. So he mentions, for example, a pacemaker can be like a cyborg relation. So now instead of the embodiment relation. So it's a little bit like the embodiment relation, right? Because you have a body 2 with the pacemaker that can now go out and do things. But the technology sort of doesn't stand there to change your affordance space. It doesn't change your affordance space. Well, that's actually not true, because of course without the pacemaker you could not go very far. You might say, I can't reach this far, but it reconstitutes the affordance space that you had with your healthy heart, you could say. But what is important as a difference from the embodiment relation is that the embodiment relation, this was very important to Heidegger in terms of like putting down the hammer, right, and studying the hammer. So now when the pen doesn't work, I put it down and now I'm body 1 again, and there's no more ink in it, whatever. Right? I now operate on that item, right? So the cyborg relation you can't take off, right? So you can't triangulate your powers in relation to the extended powers. It is sort of incorporated in the back in this kind of non-optional way. Of course, that's not entirely true, right? Because for all brain-machine interfaces, so Cody just had the example of the EEG in the store, and you just put it on and take it off, right? And it's sort of a little bit like an embodiment relation, but it like kind of works on the brain, you could say. Like, so you're not meeting, but you are kind of meeting that perfume now with this new enhanced, it's almost like a hermeneutic, right, relation added, like in this kind of embodiment form. But a lot of the cyborg relations you cannot triangulate your way away from. As Michelle was saying, like they act directly with your nervous system, and in that sense becomes part of that opaque medium that we don't have access to. But they often actually involve this external data storage, analytics, and networked capabilities, right? So those things are out in the world, sort of not incorporated, right? But those are often also, I actually tried to make AI generate a nice picture for me of somebody standing with their back to the computer, and it just didn't want to do it. It was 10 rounds, and it was bad outcomes every time. But the idea is that you have an external world support of this system that is not within your affordance space. So it's not like the hammer and the pen where you put it down typically. They are typically cooped up in proprietary ownerships of companies, right? And outside the affordance space of the person actually using this, and therefore sort of behind our back, right? And this is very interesting because already in 1990, when Don Ihde wrote Technology and the Life World, he mused the following. So it's like where you can interrogate the pen and the hammer. He's like, what occurs through mediation is not a problem because our construction of the observation presupposes ordinary practical spatiality. So this is an example with a telescope. We aim the telescope at the indicated place in the sky, and before looking through it, note that the distance is at least that of the heavenly dome. So his idea is there that I understand, so I get this interpreted result through the telescope, and that could be very disorienting to my general knowledge of the world, because it's like now I look like I'm close to the moon. But because I moved to the telescope from my body 1, I understand what the mediating technology does to my cognition, and I can place that new knowledge within that broader space. So here, of course, this is another challenging thing about, do we out of time? Oh my God. Okay, so about neurotechnology. So now, of course, what I want to raise is, given these backgrounds, given this knowledge, how do we think of trusting a company to mediate this magic of our mind? We know that many of these companies, so I'm not going to get to the hive mind and their goal of linking us all and freeing us from actually having a a body-world relationship at all, and having some kind of brain-brain symbiosis. But I want to just highlight what we have seen with technologies that has already been introduced. Right, so Cody talked about surveillance capitalism. I think that Zuboff would say that you can neatly place these neurocapitalism within surveillance capitalism because, again, the goal is, the same, right? So for her, it's about behavioral rendition, prediction, and manipulation through creation of prediction products, right? This is what these data allows these neuro companies to do. Cory Doctorow, of course, has talked about enshittification, and which he is like, particularly when you have a grasp on the consumer, when you have monopoly, when you have dependence, you enshittify the product for the consumer. And this, so what my point I want to say about this whole big setup about how action works and how the cyborg relation works is that it's ultra vulnerable to what we already see in enshittification, because it's going to be extreme dependence and out of sight, right? And most of these products cannot easily be discontinued to be put down, etc. And the information that is rendered is, of course, enormously crucial for behavioral control in various ways. To conclude, basically, I've tried to put out some sort of background thoughts on the sort of opacity of action, our ability to extend our agency, like our ability to engage with these interfaces, and the incredibly unfortunate situation it puts us in respect to our normal testing mechanisms, our normal ways of verifying trust, our normal power relations in terms of being able to push back, and conditions that often are necessary for making people follow the guidance, for maybe making people wanting to do the ethical thing. That takes leverage, a leverage that the user of these cyborg devices typically don't have. And so what I want to say, yes, the medium is the message, McLuhan is right, but it's not the message because you can't bring it in front, right? So when the medium can't be the message, right? and so this is why we should be so careful when we break open that skull that was protected for a reason and pulled away from the social space. So thank you.
So we will take 15 minutes for questions. We'll modify the schedule slightly for that, but we have leeway. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll try and grab everyone.
Laura, the typology that you created of from vague to specific, I wonder if you think it maps onto the degree to which there is the ethics washing to ethics being, crypto-socialist Luddism, basically. Because in general, I think, the general aspiration to respect patient autonomy or something like that is something that you would see when the firm is not trying to be legislative. But the degree to which you actually are saying something like, let's take half of the stock of all these companies and put it in a public trust or something like that, something very confrontational. And the reason I wonder about this is because also the ethics field of AI ethics has gotten very politicized in the last couple of years. It used to be kind of aspirational, and then it became, the rubber met the road with firms like OpenAI and the coup against Sam Altman, and are we actually going to hold these firms to account? And when it went to the White House recently, it's like, are we going to have pre-approval for systems? It's like, oh no, that's anti-capitalist. So I wonder if you think that there's that trend as well in terms of looking at an ethics document. Does it actually tell us what to do?
Yeah, I think that's probably right, that the less actionable the document, right, like the more generic, the more likely it is just lip service, or it can be used as that. I don't think that all the people who create very general, generic ethics guidance are kind of like intending to, but I think you're right that there's a Venn diagram with some overlap there, because for the point I said, like, you can have a very generic statement of values or a mission statement, right? And it's just, who knows what that means, or like if that is actually going to do anything in practice. And so that's basically taking that insight to ethics guidance and saying you can have it be incredibly general, and it's sort of just like we're waving our hands around with some ethical concepts. Yeah.
So I wanted to take a question from Cody's talk and direct it to Maria, because the question being essentially whether neurotechnology demands new rights or kind of a sui generis kind of ethical or political regulation, or just extension of existing principles, because the kind of vulnerability to, you know, adopting a technology, becoming dependent on it, giving up all your leverage to a company which then institutifies it or manipulates you in some way. You kind of said some things that made it sound like there's really a special boundary that is crossed when it's going right into your brain. But you also said some things that made it sound like this is continuous with things they've done with social media or potentially, I don't know, telescopes. I mean, probably telescopes are fine ethically, but then, like, I guess I'm asking, like, where is the line between technology that we're basically okay at handling at present versus technology that we need to adopt some new ethical precautions or protections for?
Thank you so much. So I actually was thinking when Cody had the question about, like, oh, we're fine with surveillance capitalism, but what about neurocapitalism? I'm not fine with surveillance capitalism at all, at all. And I think that this behavioral, so like I had like the little cyborg roach, right? Picture. I don't know if you know these kind of studies, but you can basically remote control this roach through a chip that excites the senses of outside of the roach. So it wouldn't actually qualify as directly interacting with the nervous system. It's through, and I think that's like our feet on the phone is like, manipulating us from that distance. But the cyborg roach can be remote controlled, right? And I don't think it's okay to set up things that can remote control us, whether they are based on sort of neurotech or whether they are based on surveillance, behavioral manipulation through our control of our experiential world, right? And so, but that doesn't answer the question of, like, should there be special protections, for other reasons, right? So I think that I almost want to do it the other way, that if we can use like that field of neuroethics to conceptualize some harms that might make us see that these are also harms in other cases. I would probably prefer that, because I think that our autonomy and our distance to others actually needs some spatial distance in the world. And I think, for example, personalization is profoundly harmful for our epistemic orientation that governs our autonomy. And yeah. So, I don't know.
I would say I don't have strong beliefs about this, but I would say it's always astounding to me the kind of inferences that surveillance capitalism as it currently exists can draw about people. Someone gives ostensibly non-sensitive data to Spotify about their music preferences, and there are cases where surveillance capitalists can reliably infer sensitive information, like someone's sexual orientation or something like that. And so, and also with the current AI systems and the inferences they're able to draw based upon the data that you're giving them. And so, I think the data that already exists that surveillance capitalists are harvesting is already used to draw such sensitive inferences that doesn't strike me as categorically different from the kind of inferences that might be drawn from neural data, my intuitions, I think, start to shift if we're actually considering a kind of sci-fi like mind reading technology or something like that, right? Where someone can actually listen to my thoughts in the same manner that they can listen to a podcast. I don't think that is necessarily on the horizon. I'm not like super close to the frontier of this technology. I know Nita Farani in her book on this talks about how AI is improving the capacity for neural decoding and translation, but I think now it's just kind of correlating neural decoding with like selective aspects of mental content, not like where you can actually like hear my thoughts or something like that. But if a technology like that did exist, that does strike me as kind of categorically different and way more privacy invasive than standard surveillance capitalism as it currently exists.
Okay. I'm actually going to go deeper into that point there. I'm wondering, because you mentioned that brain data rather than behavior becomes kind of the primary currency, and Zuboff's work, as I understand it, is primarily about the predictive power of technology, not the nature of the data itself, and also how that drives offline behavior. And so what do you think is the utility of the term neurocapitalism as distinct from surveillance capitalism? Do you consider that they are distinct, or that it offers its own something kind of to grab onto? And then my second question, which also for anyone, but building off of your remarks, is on the new rights versus existing rights point, and on how you conceptualize that debate. It seemed in your presentation that you were saying that the Neurorights movement is for a new right to mental privacy, which is, at least at the Neurorights Foundation, the opposite of how we approach it. And there are, you just mentioned Nina Farahani. I mean, she is a vocal proponent of creating new rights and a new right to cognitive liberty, for example, which is a very different approach, but falls squarely outside of the Neurorights framework. So how do you think about that space?
The first question, honestly, I don't think like well-formed beliefs with respect to either questions, to be quite frank. With respect to the first question, yeah, the neurocapitalism derives from a paper that I was reading on the subject, but I think, I think I wouldn't conceptualize it, especially given the remarks that I just made, as like a completely new form of surveillance capitalism. I would conceptualize it as the next iteration. So maybe we don't need a new term for that. Because yeah, I think the same kind of like behavioral herding that surveillance capitalism runs on can just be run on neural data, right? Just as surveillance capitalists can know my route home each week and then suggest a restaurant that's on that route and kind of like herd me towards particular behaviors in the world. The same thing could be done with neural data. Maybe at a more intimate level, right, where the neural data can be harvested to suggest to surveillance capitalists when I'm the most persuadable, like based on my state of mind, and then advertise to me when I'm in that state of mind. And so, yeah, I guess my default disposition would be to conceptualize it as an exacerbation of surveillance capitalism rather than something entirely new. With respect to the Neurorights debate, honestly, I think you would know better than me. I don't have, what you said strikes me as right in terms of like what the position that Nita carves out in her book. I don't know. I don't have like a strong position myself on what the, I guess both conceptually in terms of whether these should be neural rights, and then also practically what's the most pragmatic in terms of like adjudicating this and protecting brain data. So.
I'll add that to make it specific, like my understanding of this debate is that a lot of it, at least philosophically, is around the right to mental integrity. So it's not rights generically, but it's the idea that, right, like some people, I think Nita thinks that there is a right to mental integrity, and that is like this novel right. And Jennifer Blumenthal-Barbie has an article that is basically saying like, this isn't doing anything new, and it also doesn't really make sense, which I think is a pretty compelling argument. So yeah.
And so just like a quick addition about like so I don't know if it's new rights, but there's something, and also speaking to Luke's presentation yesterday about that kind of merging of what is myself and what is another. And I don't know if it should be a new right, but there's something profoundly disorienting in not knowing if it was you or if it was another. And it is very frequent in the case of brain-machine interfaces that this constantly happens, but it can also happen, like I say, in cases of personalization. Is this just the world, or is this something of my own fantasy that's been spit out there by the company, right? And so I can't see the difference between what is the world, what is the other, what is me, right? So like those, like, but, and I do think that, and I don't know which rights gets at that, right? Because we also don't have epistemic rights, right? It is something about autonomy also, right? And individual freedom, but it's not clear. Yeah.
But I'll just add, I think there is, that sometimes it can be overblown, like the idea that our preferences or our choices are our own, right? So I work in feminist relational autonomy, and there, right, there's this point about adaptive preferences, which is basically that we adapt our preferences to the context that we live in. And so I think that this conversation raises like an interesting question about the extent to which, especially in Western culture, we're committed to like ownership and autonomy, whether those things actually hold, or if we're just learning as we engage with new technologies that we never had them all along.
Yeah, no, I completely, I think that autonomy is relational, and I don't think individuality is a simple thing, but I think it is in many cases a valuable achievement to have some level of individual freedom and choice of like, so it's like almost like you start into it. Anyway, you can talk more after.
Maria, question for you about the phenomenology of fusion and merging. I wonder if there's another level of that also, like in, for example, in the case of pacemakers, that not only can you not sort of set it aside and, as it were, look at it from the side, but also your life depends on it. So this constant knowledge that you sort of can't live without it seems to be, one different layer of the phenomenology of fusion. And I mean, as I think about it, it doesn't have to, this sense of anxiety and dependence, as it were, it doesn't have to involve fusion. Like in the winter in New England, your life depends on your furnace working. And so you can have the same relationship with your heating system. But still, it seems like there's something different in having something fused with you that you kind of sort of have a background knowledge that you can't live without.
Right, and so this is like, and that you would be able to see if we make like our parentheses, right, about like how you're meeting the world, where the furnace and that dependency is out here in your world environment, and you call in the electrician, right? It's a simple, it's different in your action space, right? And so it's like that, so the reason why the dependence, I'm not trying to say that there would be a unique dependence, like some of these devices also you can replace them. But what I wanted to say was that like the enshittification is what we just observe is that when there is dependence, the enshittification is easier. Right, so what I wanted to kind of set up is that, like, in that, like, kind of that ultra vulnerability, and of course, like, if somebody holds your heating hostage, right, that is also a very effective means of controlling somebody.
So both Laura and Cody, to some extent, touched on this idea that it's sort of not really ethics if you're like offloading the decision-making process in a way. So whether that's like sort of following a clear set of ethical guidelines rather than like thinking through it yourself versus, or like if you're sort of like, if you got an enhancement that sort of gives you the empathy rather than like being empathetic yourself, right? And so in both cases with that sort of skepticism, I guess I was wondering whether we couldn't envision versions of ethics documents or neural enhancements that like help us actually do ethics better rather than just sort of like offloading the process to something else, right? Like isn't there such a thing as a guidance document that like encourages people to like think through ethics themselves, right? Or for example, couldn't we imagine like a neural implant that like helps you actually like make ethical decisions the right Kantian way rather than just sort of like automating it, right? I don't know. I guess if either of you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, Jay's written on this actually, and I would say as a virtue ethicist, yeah, you can imagine. I kind of briefly touched upon this in the talk, but you can imagine different kinds of neural interventions that just give you more of an opportunity to cultivate the habits that lead to virtue. Right? So maybe something that gives you greater impulse control. It doesn't necessarily, it's not like bypassing the process, but it's facilitating the process in a way that was harder before. And so I think, I think you can combine different kinds of neuroenhancement and neural interventions, but you can implement them in a judicious, wise manner such that instead of like bypassing the hard work that morality demands, you're just kind of allowing those technological interventions to facilitate it. So I would think that's the kind of ideal that we should be aiming towards as a virtue ethicist.
I was actually one of those working groups I was on. They created a guidance document. We ended up doing it in terms of questions, like reflective questions to consider, and again, like I don't know, like it felt better to have it be as questions instead of being like you ought to do this or you should do this. But I do think the skepticism at the end is about whether guidance, whether a document is what we want. So like I think practices like having ethicists embedded in labs, right? And so there are interpersonal relationships where people are talking about ethical. I think that is way more effective. I mean, ultimately it's a psychological question, right? Like how do we encourage ethical behavior? It kind of depends on like, do you think we need to just do a behavioral economics kind of like, right? And like change the incentive structure or, but I like the embedded ethicist one because I do think that people are strongly motivated and tend to learn moral practices through interpersonal relationships. So yeah, maybe it's not a document.
I would also say just quickly, Sarah Gorey has done a lot of good work on like user-centered design in BCI. And so yeah, not just bringing ethicists into the lab, but actually bringing the users of these technologies and have them be active participants in the designing of it. Because all too often you have tech companies that just, they realize that they can create some technology, and so they just do because they can, without actually considering whether that technology is tailored towards the users that it's designed for. And so I think bringing those users in and having them be active participants in the design process is a good way to go.
Okay, we are out of time. I know there are a couple of questions remaining, but that's evidence of a very stimulating panel, so let's thank our speakers.